The day my son left me at a nursing home. He hugged me and said, "Mom, this is for your own good." I nodded. I even smiled. Because at that moment, my son Daniel and my daughter-in-law Stephanie believed something very important. They believed I was a helpless old woman. They believed I had nowhere else to go. And most importantly, they believed the house was finally theirs. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks later, while they were redecorating my living room and throwing out my husband's things, I was going to walk back into that house with a lawyer and legally throw them out, because the house they thought they inherited still belonged to me. But to understand how we got there, you need to understand what happened after my husband died. My husband Robert and I were married for 42 years. We built our home together, every brick, every wall, every memory inside it. Our son Daniel grew up there. Birthday parties in the backyard, Christmas mornings in the living room, family dinners at the oak table Robert built with his own hands. It was never just a house, it was our life. But when Robert died, everything changed faster than I expected. The funeral was on a rainy Thursday morning. By the time Sunday arrived, most of the family had already gone back to their normal lives, except for Daniel and Stephanie. They came over that afternoon, and the conversation they started told me something I wasn't prepared to hear. We were sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Robert and I drank coffee every morning for decades. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Stephanie looked organized, like she had already planned what she was about to say. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said gently, "we've been thinking about your situation." My situation. I had been a widow for 3 days. "What situation?" I asked. Stephanie leaned forward. "Well, you shouldn't be living alone anymore." I blinked. "I've lived here for 40 years. Yes," she said, "but things are different now." Daniel nodded quickly. "It's just not safe." Not safe. I almost laughed. I still drove my own car. I still cooked my own meals. I still took care of my garden. But apparently losing my husband had suddenly made me incapable of living. Then Stephanie placed a glossy brochure on the table. I looked down. A smiling elderly couple stared back at me from the cover. Sunrise Meadows Senior Living. "A nursing home," I asked quietly. "It's a retirement community," she corrected, "with medical staff and activities." Daniel added, "You'll have friends there, Mom." Friends. Apparently strangers in a building were supposed to replace the life I had built in my home. "I'm not leaving my house," I said calmly. Daniel and Stephanie exchanged a glance. Then Stephanie said something that made the room feel colder. "Well, technically it isn't really your house anymore." I looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" Daniel sighed. "Mom, when Dad passed, the house became part of the inheritance." Stephanie nodded. "And since Daniel is the only child," her sentence hung unfinished, but the meaning was clear. "They thought the house now belonged to him," which meant they thought they could move in, and I could move out. The strange thing is, I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't even correct them. Instead, I simply nodded. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. The relief on Stephanie's face was immediate. Daniel smiled like a problem had just been solved. "We'll help you move," he said. Stephanie added, "There's an opening at Sunrise Meadows next month." Everything had already been arranged. That told me something important. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a plan. A plan they had clearly been discussing long before they talked to me. So I let them believe they had won. Because sometimes, the best way to reveal the truth is to let people walk straight into their own mistake. And Daniel and Stephanie were about to make a very expensive one. Because the house they were planning to move into, the house they thought they had inherited, was still legally mine. Robert had made sure of that years ago. They just didn't know it yet. But they would soon. Very soon. 2 weeks later, my son drove me to the nursing home. It was a bright Monday morning. Daniel loaded 2 small suitcases into the back of his car, while Stephanie stood on the porch of my house, watching. Not sadly, not emotionally, just observing, like someone inspecting a property they were about to move into. "Do you have everything, Mom?" Daniel asked. I looked back at the house. 42 years of my life inside those walls. The kitchen where Robert and I shared morning coffee. The living room where our son took his first steps. The garden Robert planted the summer Daniel turned 10. And now I was leaving it with 2 suitcases. "Yes," I said quietly. "I have everything." That wasn't entirely true, but the things I left behind were the things Daniel and Stephanie didn't notice. The photographs, Robert's tools, the furniture, and most importantly, the legal papers inside my desk drawer. Papers that proved something they clearly didn't understand. The house was still legally mine. The nursing home was called Sunrise Meadows Senior Living. Stephanie had been very proud of that name. She had said it at least 5 times while showing me the brochures. Sunrise Meadows has a beautiful garden. Sunrise Meadows has a dining hall. Sunrise Meadows has wonderful activities. When we arrived, the building looked exactly like the pictures. Bright, clean, smiling staff members, but something about it felt like a waiting room for the rest of your life. A young nurse greeted us at the entrance. "Welcome, Mrs. Collins." Daniel helped carry my suitcases inside. Stephanie followed behind, already looking at her watch. The check-in process took about 30 minutes. Forms, signatures, basic information. When it was finished, the nurse showed us my room. It was small, one bed, one dresser, one window. Daniel tried to sound positive. It's cozy, Mom, Stephanie added, and you'll have so many people to talk to. I smiled politely, because arguing would change nothing, but inside my head, I kept thinking the same thing. They were so eager to leave. After the nurse finished explaining the daily schedule, Daniel stood up. Well, he said, clapping his hands together awkwardly, I guess we should get going. Of course. They had a house to move into. Stephanie hugged me quickly. If you need anything, just call. Daniel hugged me too. A little longer, but even he looked distracted. Take care of yourself, Mom, he said. Then they walked out together. I watched them through the window as they crossed the parking lot. Stephanie said something excitedly while Daniel unlocked the car. They both laughed, and a few minutes later, they drove away. Straight back to my house. That same evening, my phone rang. It was Daniel. Hi, Mom, he said. Hi, Daniel. You settled in, okay? Yes, that's good. There was a pause. Then he said something that confirmed exactly what I expected. We stopped by the house today. Of course they did. It needs a little cleaning, Stephanie's voice said in the background. Daniel chuckled nervously. Yeah, Steph's already making a list of changes. Changes. I imagine Stephanie walking through every room, deciding what to keep, what to throw away, what to replace. My home becoming their project. Well, I said calmly, just be careful with Robert's things. Of course, Mom. But something about his voice told me he wasn't really listening. 3 days later, my neighbor Mrs. Harper called me. Margaret, she said immediately. Yes? I thought you should know something. My stomach tightened. What is it? I saw Stephanie outside your house this morning. That wasn't surprising, but then she continued. She was throwing boxes into a dumpster. A dumpster? What kind of boxes? I asked quietly. Old things, Mrs. Harper said. Tools, papers, I think some photo albums. My chest tightened. Those weren't just old things. They were Robert's belongings, memories, decades of our life together. Thank you for telling me, I said. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my small room, and for the first time since arriving at the nursing home, I opened my purse and took out a folded piece of paper. Robert's handwriting covered the top. He had written it 5 years earlier, after a conversation we once had about inheritance. At the time, Daniel and Stephanie had just started talking about moving to a bigger house. Robert had laughed and said something I never forgot. Let's make sure no one pushes you out of your own home. So he met with a lawyer, quietly, without telling anyone, and the document I was holding proved something Daniel and Stephanie hadn't bothered to check. The house had never been transferred. It was still entirely under my name, which meant legally they had no right to it. Not now, not ever. I folded the paper slowly, because now that I knew what they were doing in my house, it was time to make a phone call of my own. And when Daniel and Stephanie came home one evening a week later, they were going to find something waiting for them on the front door. A legal notice, one that would change their celebration into complete shock. 7 days after Daniel and Stephanie moved into my house, they came home to find a large white envelope taped to the front door. At least, that's what my neighbor Mrs. Harper told me later that evening. She had been watering her flowers across the street when Daniel pulled into the driveway. Stephanie got out of the car first. She was carrying 2 shopping bags and talking excitedly about something. Probably furniture, or curtains, or whatever other changes she had been making inside my home. Mrs. Harper said Stephanie stopped suddenly when she saw the envelope. "What's this?" she asked. Daniel walked up behind her and peeled it off the door. At first he looked confused, then his face changed. "Steph," he said slowly, "it's from a lawyer." Stephanie laughed. "A lawyer? About what?" Daniel opened the envelope, and as he read the first page, his face turned pale. Mrs. Harper told me Stephanie tried to grab the paper. "What does it say?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the page like he couldn't believe the words. Finally, he read the first sentence out loud. "This property is legally owned by Margaret Collins, and any unauthorized occupancy must cease immediately." Stephanie blinked. "What?" Daniel read the next line again, slower this time. "The occupants currently residing at the address have no legal ownership or tenancy rights." Stephanie laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded nervous. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Daniel inherited the house." Daniel shook his head. "No, apparently not." Mrs. Harper said Stephanie's face went completely blank. "But your dad died," she said. "That means everything goes to you." Daniel flipped through the rest of the document. "I guess it doesn't work that way." Stephanie crossed her arms. "This must be a mistake." But Daniel was still reading, and the more he read, the worse his expression became, because the notice explained everything very clearly. The house had been purchased under my name decades earlier, and 5 years ago, Robert had signed additional documents ensuring the property would remain legally mine after his death. Daniel had assumed inheritance worked automatically, but Robert had made sure that assumption would never push me out of my home. That evening, my phone rang. I already knew who it was before I answered. "Mom?" Daniel's voice said. "Yes, Daniel. What is this letter we just got?" I could hear Stephanie in the background. "She must have made some mistake," she was whispering loudly. "It says you still own the house," Daniel said. "That's correct." Silence. Then Stephanie grabbed the phone. "Margaret," she said sharply, "there has obviously been a misunderstanding." "No," I replied calmly, "there hasn't. The house belongs to Daniel now." "It doesn't. But Robert died." "Yes. And when he died," she continued, "everything transferred to his family. That's not how our paperwork was written." Stephanie went quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made her frustration obvious. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" I smiled slightly. "Because the answer was simple. You never asked." Daniel took the phone back. "Mom, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," I replied, "that the house you're living in still belongs to me." Another long silence. Then Stephanie's voice exploded in the background. "This is ridiculous." Daniel tried to calm her down. "Steph, no," she snapped. "We moved our furniture in. We cleaned the entire place." I listened quietly, because the truth was, they hadn't just cleaned the house. They had been throwing away pieces of my life, and now they were realizing something important. They had been redecorating a house that was never theirs. "Mom," Daniel said finally, "what happens now?" His voice sounded smaller than before, less confident, less certain. I folded my hands in my lap. "Well," I said gently, "the letter explains that." He flipped the page again. I could hear the paper rustling. Then he read the line out loud. "Occupants are required to vacate the property within 14 days. Stephanie gasped. "You can't be serious." But the letter was very serious. 14 days, 2 weeks, the same amount of time it had taken them to move me out of my home. Daniel sighed heavily. "Mom, where are we supposed to go?" I thought about that question for a moment. Then I said the same words they had once said to me. "I'm sure you'll find somewhere comfortable." Stephanie went completely silent, because she recognized the sentence immediately. It was the exact thing she had said when she showed me the nursing home brochures. And now the roles had reversed. That night, as I sat in my small room at Sunrise Meadows, I looked out the window and thought about Robert. 5 years earlier, he had told me something very simple. "Margaret," he said, "people show you who they really are when they think you're powerless." At the time, I hadn't understood why he said it. But now I did, because Daniel and Stephanie had believed I was powerless, old, alone, easy to move out of the way. They had believed they could take my house without even checking the paperwork, and now they had exactly 14 days to learn something important. The house they thought they owned was about to welcome its real owner home, and when I walked back through that front door, their reaction would be something the entire neighborhood would remember for years. 14 days passed quickly, too quickly for Daniel and Stephanie, but exactly on schedule for me. During those 2 weeks, Daniel called 3 times. The first time, he tried to sound calm. "Mom, maybe we should talk about the letter." "We already did," I replied. "Well, maybe there's another solution." "There is." "What?" "You move out." Silence. The second call came 3 days later. This time, Stephanie was on the line too. "Margaret," she said, trying to sound polite, "you can't seriously expect us to leave the house." "I don't expect it," I said calmly. "The law does." "You're being unreasonable," she snapped. And the third call came the night before the deadline. Daniel sounded tired. "Mom, we need more time." "For what? To find somewhere else." I thought about the day they showed me the nursing home brochures. The way Stephanie had said everything so confidently. "It's the best solution for everyone." And the way Daniel had hugged me goodbye in the parking lot. "Take care of yourself, Mom." They hadn't asked if I needed more time. They hadn't asked how it felt to leave my home. So I simply said, "You have until tomorrow." Then I hung up. The next morning, a black car pulled up outside my house. I was sitting in the back seat beside my lawyer, Mr. Harrison. He was a quiet man in his early 60s who had handled Robert's paperwork years ago. "Are you ready, Mrs. Collins?" he asked. I looked through the window at my house. The same front porch, the same oak tree in the yard, but the curtains in the windows were different now. Stephanie's taste, I assumed. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Mr. Harrison stepped out first. I followed slowly behind him, and together we walked toward the front door. Before we could knock, the door opened. Daniel stood there. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Mom," he said. Behind him, Stephanie appeared. Her arms were crossed. "You actually came," she said. I stepped inside the doorway. "This is my house," I replied. Stephanie rolled her eyes. "We're still packing," Daniel added quickly. "We just need a little more time." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "You received the legal notice 14 days ago." "Yes," Daniel said. "But finding a place takes time." Stephanie pointed toward the living room. "You can see we're working on it." I looked around. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Furniture had been moved, but the room also looked different. Robert's old armchair was gone. The bookshelf he built had disappeared, and the family photos that once covered the wall were missing. "Where are the pictures?" I asked. Stephanie shrugged. "Old stuff. We packed some of it." My chest tightened, and the rest, she hesitated. Some things weren't really worth keeping. Mr. Harrison spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "The occupants were required to vacate the property today." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "Mom, please." His voice sounded desperate now, but Stephanie stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're throwing your own son out." I looked at her carefully. "No," I said. "You moved into my house." Mr. Harrison handed Daniel a second document. "This is the final notice," he explained. If the property is not vacated today, the court will authorize removal. Stephanie grabbed the paper. You're actually doing this? Yes, I said quietly. Daniel looked around the room, at the boxes, at the half-empty shelves, at the life they had already started building here. Then he sighed. All right. Stephanie spun toward him. What do you mean, all right? We'll leave, he said. But she's your mother, and it's her house. Stephanie stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she turned toward me. You planned this. No, I said. You did. By late afternoon, a moving truck was parked outside. Mrs. Harper stood across the street watching the entire scene, just like she had watched them move in, except this time, they were leaving. Daniel carried boxes quietly. Stephanie slammed the truck doors louder than necessary. Neither of them looked at me as they worked. And when the truck was finally loaded, Daniel walked over to the porch. Mom, he said softly. Yes, I didn't realize about the paperwork. I know. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that sounded more honest than anything he had said in weeks. I should have asked. Yes, I replied. You should have. Stephanie climbed into the passenger seat of the truck without saying goodbye. The engine started, and a few seconds later, they drove away, leaving the house behind them. That evening, I walked through my house for the first time in weeks. It felt different. Not because the furniture had moved, but because the silence had returned. The kind of quiet Robert and I used to share on peaceful evenings. Mr. Harrison stood near the doorway. Everything seems in order, he said. Thank you for your help. He nodded. Your husband planned very carefully. I smiled faintly. Yes, he did. 5 years earlier, Robert had called me into his study. He had been reviewing documents with Mr. Harrison. Margaret, he said, sit down for a minute. I remember laughing. Am I in trouble? No, he said. But I've been thinking about something. What? Daniel. At the time, Daniel and Stephanie had just started talking about buying a bigger house. They had even joked about eventually inheriting ours. Robert didn't laugh. Instead, he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes people start planning for things before they should, so he made a decision. The house would stay under my name. No automatic transfer, no assumption, no confusion. If anything ever happened to him, I would always have a place to live. At the time, it felt unnecessary, but now it felt like the most thoughtful gift he ever gave me. Later that night, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, the same chair Robert used to sit in. Outside, the porch light glowed softly, and for the first time since his death, the house felt like home again. But the story didn't end there, because 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Daniel, and what he said next was something I never expected to hear. Mom, he said quietly, I think we need to talk. 3 weeks after Daniel and Stephanie moved out of my house, my phone rang. It was late in the evening. I was sitting in the living room, reading one of Robert's old books, when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. Not out of anger, just hesitation. A lot had happened between us in a short amount of time, but eventually I answered. Hello? Mom, Daniel said quietly. His voice sounded different. Not confident, not frustrated. Just tired. Yes, Daniel. There was a pause before he spoke again. I think we need to talk. I looked around the living room, the same living room he had grown up in, the same house he had tried to move me out of. About what? I asked. Everything. Another pause. Then he added something that surprised me. I didn't realize how wrong we were. I didn't respond immediately, because those words were something I had been waiting to hear. Not an excuse, not an argument, just nothing like the house. I nodded quietly, even though he couldn't see me. Daniel, I said gently, why did you think the house was yours? He sighed. I guess we just assumed. Dad always said the house would stay in the family, and it did, I said, but not the way you expected. He laughed weakly. Yeah, I figured that out. Another silence passed. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Can I come over tomorrow? I thought about it. Then I said, yes. The next afternoon, Daniel knocked on the front door. When I opened it, he looked older somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. Life has a way of aging people quickly when reality hits them. Hi, Mom, he said. Hello, Daniel. He stepped inside slowly. His eyes moved around the room, the furniture, the photos, the same house he had packed his boxes out of just weeks earlier. I forgot how quiet it is here, he said. Yes, I replied. It always has been. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table Robert built 40 years ago. Daniel stared at the wood for a moment. I'm sorry, he said finally. I waited. For trying to move you out, he continued. For assuming the house belonged to me. And for not asking. His voice cracked slightly at the last sentence, because that was the truth. If he had simply asked, everything would have been different. Stephanie was excited about the house, he said quietly. She thought it would be perfect for our family. And you, I guess I just followed along. I looked at him carefully. Daniel, do you know why your father arranged the paperwork the way he did? He shook his head. Because he believed something very simple, I said. What? That people should never feel powerless in their own home. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounds like him. Yes, I said. It does. He looked around again. I miss him. So do I. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked something I hadn't expected. Mom, do you think we can fix this? The question hung quietly between us, because trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself instantly, but families sometimes deserve a second chance. I think that depends, I said. On what? On what happens next? Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. That evening, after Daniel left, I walked through my house again, the same house Robert and I built together, the same house that had nearly been taken from me by the people who assumed I was too old to fight back. But the truth is, this story was never really about the house. It was about something else, something Robert understood long before any of this happened. People often show their true character when they believe someone is powerless. Daniel and Stephanie believed I was powerless, a grieving widow, an elderly woman they could move into a nursing home, but Robert had made sure I would never be in that position. He didn't just leave me a house, he left me protection, respect, and the ability to stand up for myself when it mattered most. And sometimes, the greatest lesson people learn isn't from what you say, it's from what happens when they realize they were wrong.